Welcome to another episode of the Future Money Podcast. As the summer sun shines brightly and the days grow longer, we hope you're making the most of this beautiful season. We have an important update about our summer podcast schedule. We're adjusting our release schedule to allow everyone, including ourselves, to enjoy the slower pace of summer. But don't worry, we're not stopping altogether. Instead of publishing 2 episodes per month, we will be delivering 1 episode per month. This new schedule will give you, our valued listeners, more time to savor each episode and delve deeper into insights on how digital financial tools are empowering and changing lives around the world. This temporary change begins on May 28th and will return to our regular schedule on September 10th. We deeply appreciate your understanding and continued support. From the Future Money team, we wish you a summer filled with joy and relaxation.
Hi, welcome to the Future Money Podcast. I am Brianna Marbury, President and CEO of the Interledger Foundation. Today, we wanted to present something special. You are listening to the first iteration of the Interledger Salon, a quarterly panel presented by the Interledger Foundation. Our goal with these curated discussions is to help some of the most interesting people in our ecosystem who, like us, work with energy and passion to build a more equitable financial world. This will be a space for conversation, sharing, and organizing together. As you may know, the Interledger Foundation is a global nonprofit organization that promotes the adoption of the Interledger Protocol, which we believe will ease the way in which payments are sent around the world. We advocate for adopting open, interoperable payment solutions while supporting organizations that want to build on Interledger and maintain a robust open source community. ILF supports innovation unapologetically centered on equity and inclusion in global open payment networks. We work with a variety of stakeholders from entrepreneurs, academics, and government agencies who are working towards making payments easier. We also actively support underrepresented groups and vulnerable populations in advancing digital financial inclusion. If we view digital financial inclusion as a critical enabler of economic growth, poverty reduction, and social development, particularly in economies where large portions are disconnected from established financial services, we must be a loud chorus asking how we might better leverage digital financial solutions. At ILF, we are excited to bring our strengths and resources to a larger ecosystem of organizations and people who see the potential of digital financial inclusion, but have also learned that without ethical and responsible tools, the path more often than not leads to exclusion. We hope to push digital financial inclusion to help see and build better futures that imagine systems that aren't subject to outdated models, technology, and power. Can open standards and protocols for exchanging value broaden our thinking about some of our most persistent economic problems? This approach also demands new ideas and metrics that shape outcomes that increase the potential scale of economic participation, lower transaction costs and make new business models attractive, and reduce the importance of physical and political obstacles. I have little doubt that the Interledger Protocol is essential to expanding digital financial inclusion. ILF and our commitment to an open source approach require participation in open payment standards that will create a more equitable ecosystem. This is a massive challenge, and to succeed, we must come together and share our collective strengths and augment our weaknesses. Therefore, I am excited to kick off this first salon with a conversation that both weaves the bouquet of issues together and inspires us to move forward with clarity and optimism. So please enjoy this discussion between Jayshree Venkatesan, Senior Director of Consumer Protection and Responsible Finance at the Center for Financial Inclusion, Ed Cable, the President and CEO of MIFOS, Paula Hunter, the Executive Director of the Mojaloop Foundation, and facilitated by our very own Chris Lawrence, Chief Program Officer at the Interledger Foundation.
Thank you, Brianna. I'm so excited today to be kicking off the Interledger Salon with this esteemed group of guests looking at this topic. First, I wanted to let all of our guests introduce themselves and their organizations. So, but maybe with a little bit of a framing question that we can kind of jump off with was, who you are and who your organization is, but also how you view your organization in advancing digital financial inclusion and the ecosystem that we all exist in. So Jayshree, maybe I'll start with you and the Center for Financial Inclusion.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brianna and the Interledger team for having me here. I think it's a great way to start a Friday morning. So my name is Jayshree. I am the Senior Director at the Center for Financial Inclusion. I lead research on consumer protection, and I help convene the Responsible Finance Forum for the sector. CFI, or the Center for Financial Inclusion, is housed within Axion as an independent think tank. And Axion, our parent company, is a global nonprofit on a mission to create a fair and inclusive economy by developing and scaling responsible digital financial services for and underserved people globally. And we do this in three ways. Axion invests in innovative solutions at an early stage and stays invested much longer than most other investors. So they truly bring the term patient capital to life. We also advise. There's a part of the parent company that works on advisory services and works with players in the digital ecosystem, ranging from fintech companies to financial service providers to platforms to now FMCG companies, and really anybody else that's uniquely positioned to deliver responsible financial products at scale to the last mile. And then CFI, a lot of our work sits in the research and thought leadership world of Axion, where we conduct research both to identify emerging risks and test innovative solutions. And then we use the evidence that we generate to develop better systems, processes, and policies that can then impact low-income people positively. Just to give you a sense of the impact that we've achieved since our founding, Axion has reached over 350 million people globally, and we work with 235 financial service providers across 75 countries. So that's how we work with the ecosystem.
Thank you, Jayshree. So, Paula, I'll kick it over to you and Mojaloop, sort of similar prompt, introduce yourselves and how you see yourself playing in this larger digital financial inclusion ecosystem.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Paula Hunter, the Executive Director of the Mojaloop Foundation. We are a nonprofit open source foundation focused on developing inclusive instant payment systems. So we do that with a very large and diverse open source community around the globe. And what we strive to do is deliver affordable, connected digital financial services to anyone with access to a mobile phone. So we do that by collaborating with central banks, payment solution companies, hub operators, other financial institutions, so that they can deploy these financial instruments out to their citizens at the lowest possible cost. But also, we want to make sure that this solution is highly interoperable. I mean, we work predominantly in Africa and Southeast Asia right now. And what we find is in some cases, the countries have some level of technology that they're using for financial solutions. We don't, in all cases, want to replace that. We want to integrate with it so that we can extend the reach of their financial services out to the broadest array of citizens.
Thanks, Paula. And we'll wrap it up here with Ed for the quick round of introductions and kind of a little bit of a starter idea about how you think you participate and MIFOS participates in the larger ecosystem of digital financial inclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Brianna, for the opportunity to participate on today's panel. So my name's Ed Cable. I run and oversee the MIFOS initiative, and we are a 501c3 fintech nonprofit as well. And our focus and mission is really to scale the development and impact of inclusive fintech to help advance the financial health of the 3 million underbanked. And we do that primarily, like Paula, by guiding our open source community and cultivating our ecosystem who build solutions around our core banking platform, Apache Fineract. We've been at this space for quite some time now. We started out almost 2 decades ago. And so we have a long track record of helping to cultivate these open source ecosystems. But essentially what our platform does is it provides that underlying account infrastructure to manage the delivery of any type of financial service. So this could be a brick and mortar SOCO, like with tellers providing services to clients. It could be a microfinance officer going out on a motorbike to its clients at a group meeting, or it could be a purely digital institution. But these institutions, they need a back office system to provide a loan account, a savings account, connect to a payment system like Mojaloop. So essentially, we provide that infrastructure, which is key and critical. And so in terms of our ecosystem, like I mentioned before, our ecosystem consists of a variety of different entities, fintechs, financial inclusion providers like MFIs, et cetera. But a key part of what we do is uniting them all around a common platform, a common standard, and helping them to advance digital financial inclusion.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. So now we're going to get into the fun stuff. And I wanted to start with you, Paula, because I've always been so super impressed with what Mojaloop has done, from your open source management, your open source contribution, and really not only advancing the work that you do, but advancing how open source plays into it, and how to do it, right? The practices of it sometimes are as more important than just the ideas. So why do you see that open source methodology, practice, and code as so vital for advancing digital financial inclusion?
Thanks, Chris. Well, first of all, open source is not only a license, it's a development practice. It's a way in which you deliver software out to the marketplace. So while we're highly interested in reducing the cost of deploying a complex system like Mojaloop out into the marketplace, we also want to make sure that we are highly engaged with those people that are going to use the solution, and make sure that it evolves to meet their needs. We're really an infrastructure play. The banks really, and the mobile money operators and such, have the relationship with the end consumer. We want to make sure that we deliver infrastructure to them that's low cost as far as deployment and operation, so that they don't have to pass high costs back down to the consumers. And the way we do that is through this open source collaboration on the code base. So what we do is we iterate regularly with the ecosystem on what are the market requirements, always evolving, of course, but what are the foundational elements that we need to build into our solution, and then how do we iterate within the community to deliver those features and functions to the marketplace, ensuring that they're tested and maintained and the like. And that's how we rely on our open source community. And what we do is we involve those central banks and hub operators and mobile money operators in the discussion, because what we want them to be able to understand is that they can deploy new services out to their customers, their citizens, in the most cost-effective way. And equally important is that they have, with open source, more control over their destiny. They can, a hub operator or a central bank, whomever, can get proprietary software to solve these problems. Problem lies in they lose control over how their financial solutions are operated, maintained, and advanced. And so with the Mojaloop community, as we bring in all these different players, we talk about the requirements, we build them into the systems. We don't turn around and invoice that bank for a new feature. We don't invoice a bank for maintaining that feature in our code base. So the net effect to the consumer, if you will, is a feature-rich environment, more services being delivered, but not incremental costs. Because of course, if any entity, commercial or government, sees more costs associated with deploying and maintaining a solution, those costs are going to be passed on to the citizens. And what we want to do is reduce transaction costs as low as possible. We're talking about high volume, low value transactions in many cases. But if you're an individual making $100 a month and you have to cash in and cash out several times a week, you have to pay microfinance loans, also have to pay your household utilities, whatever. Every time you have a transaction, that's eating away at your $100 a month. So what we want to make sure is the cost of deploying, implementing, operating this infrastructure, which is essentially a financial utility, is as low as possible, so that those entities that historically haven't served folks on the edges that are not banked are more compelled to offer services out to them, because it's not a huge cost burden to do so.
So, Jayshree, that kind of transitions interestingly. CFI is so, a lot of your work really is on the user, on the consumer, on how these products, the sort of end results sort of interact, support, sometimes hinder, right, or harm the end users, the services that these things are, people that these are designed for. So how should we think about as an ecosystem, how to best design systems, tools towards positive outcomes? And then what should we be thinking about in terms of privacy, security? What should we be thinking about with these issues as we build?
Yeah, it is a nice jumping off point. And I totally agree with Paula. I mean, I think the value in making financial services more affordable is a big driver in the uptake of digital financial services. So at CFI, we've been talking, you'll see a lot of our work has the by design approach. So we have privacy by design, we have consumer protection by design. And really that goes back to what you picked up on, Chris, which is, keeping the focus on the user and the customer at the heart. Which in itself is not new, because you see FMCG companies doing that all the time, which is you will start with consumer insights. I think what's different in our case is we want to make sure that the process is not extractive, and so we close the loop by thinking about consumer outcomes, and we keep the most vulnerable consumer at the heart of this process, because we think, and our belief is that if you design systems keeping in mind the most vulnerable user and taking care of their needs, you end up building a system that is better for everybody. The way we do that, and our focus is very much on making sure that the objectives of inclusive finance, which is what we all want to see, greater resilience in low-income consumers, greater choice, more agency, that the process fosters trust. All of those continue to be done or achieved. And the way we do that is we start with the user or the consumer at the center. And then we make sure that in the process of designing, whether it's a solution or it's a system that then impacts the consumer, we break silos. So we find, particularly with digital financial services, that product designers don't often interact with the consumer protection folks. Or we find, the financial service providers sometimes don't talk enough with regulators. So we do need to build bridges for greater interaction. And like I said, we start with consumer insights, but then we also make sure that people that are designing these services have some way in which they can walk in the shoes of the consumer. So they can then diagnose the kinds of vulnerabilities that can arise, and what are the problems that they need to address. And then finally, the evidence that we generate helps us build guardrails, both at the system level, and that's through interactions with regulators and policymakers, because every action that we take is going to have, some oblique reaction, or, something that we can't really predict. But do we have sufficient ways to create or sufficient redress mechanisms to correct that? And is the system agile enough to do that, so that we continue delivering value to consumers as a result? And that in turn, we feel will deliver value to the firms and value to businesses. So that's really at the heart of what you've picked up on. And we call that our by design approach.
Ed, that has me thinking a little bit about, we're talking about these intersections with private industry and, ethical design, and how you get outcomes and tools that are useful for folks. And Brianna said it in her opening, often with fintech, but just tech broadly, there's so many, this path of unintended consequences and, the sort of garbage in, garbage out, and the kind of tools that people do end up having to use, and so on and so forth. And so MIFOS has done a lot of work about how do we get this into the public sphere, right? Publics are, theoretically and practically often ways in which these things are guarded and managed. So I'd love to hear you think about, as you connect the dots of what Paula and Jayshree were saying, how does MIFOS think about how that kind of ethical thinking and design, to do no harm and actually to help, has applications in our public sphere, specifically with the work you do with digital public infrastructure?
Yeah. So if others aren't familiar, like right now, there is like a growing and burgeoning movement around digital public infrastructure, where governments worldwide, multilateral entities are recognizing the power of open source digital public goods and building blocks, and putting these together to provide reusable layers of infrastructure that can be shared across multiple government programs, ministries, etc. So a key important use case of that is payments, leveraging infrastructure like Mojaloop for the payment rail like MOSIP for digital identity, and then enabling this widespread reach through something like an effective digitized G2P system. And where MIFOS, helps to smooth out some of the friction and enable better adoption of both this digital public infrastructure as well as just infrastructure in general for digital financial inclusion is by really commoditizing that core underlying layer to manage the underlying accounts. So for any financial service that you're receiving, whether it's a loan account, a payment, like a savings account, you need that underlying account. And often many of these institutions that are going the last mile, reaching those most rural, most unbanked, they lack the systems and they lack the capacity to either build these systems or pay the expensive licensees for doing that. And then likewise, what Paula said around trying to help those institutions that might have the systems reach further to the edge, we also help to address that as well by commoditizing core banking infrastructure. So we want to provide that level playing field, that common infrastructure for everybody to deliver any type of an account. And then by doing that, institutions that are focused on the underbanked, they're able to focus more on consumer protection, focus more on responsible design, focus more on meeting these standards. So our goal really is to provide that underlying system to manage that account. And then that equips the institution to really focus on their mission to deliver and design unique services that advance actual meaningful usage of financial inclusion and actually drives progression on financial health as well.
So building off what all of you said, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately in this work is, obviously none of us can do it alone. We've talked very specifically about open source, both culture and practice. We've talked about the interconnectivity between these stakeholders and all these touch points in a larger ecosystem. And I think we obviously all exist within this larger, kind of world of, expanding global financial inclusion. But we all have sort of, most of us, or a lot of us, or a lot of our work really is focusing on where the digital part connects and builds on top of that in exciting ways. But it also, to me, I could be wrong, feels a little disparate sometimes. It does feel like we don't have a kind of collective mentality about how we push this forward. What do you, and also correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what do you think we need, or do we need a more of a coalition approach? Like, what is the, who do we need on that stage? What should that stage be decorated like? What do we need to do to connect better to each other and kind of push this agenda forward?
I think I'll start just with one reply. As I mentioned around digital public infrastructure, with this, there is a flurry and almost too much, movement and momentum where there are so many players trying to form coalitions, trying to bring together both the public and private sector. And so some, good efforts that have emerged are the Digital Convergence Initiative, the GovStack Initiative, as well as G2P Connect. And all of these are seeking to align a lot of these players around standards, both at the technology, but as well as the process level. So there is a bit more of a harmony amongst countries trying to adopt digital public goods. So I'd say, first off, building those coalitions is key, and then helping to identify and adopt and align the different projects and groups working on those standards. And those will help to, move the technology along in the right direction. But then that, at the end of the day, often is sometimes the simpler piece to meet. So once you do have that technology, you do have that standard in place, that gets down to actually, designing responsible products, enforcing standards that help those products to, adequately meet the consumer protection needs of the clients and what have you not. And I do think, going back to what Paula said, these open source approaches enable that to be done more effectively, because with open source, by providing that level playing field, by providing a common, what we call upstream platform that others are contributing to, that allows the ecosystem to focus on delivering a unique solution or delivering a unique application or designing a unique product or service that helps to align with those standards. So I'm excited that the industry as a whole is starting to adopt open source through digital public infrastructure, and what that means in terms of how we can cultivate ecosystems around that.
I'll jump on as well and follow up on Ed's comments. I mean, some days I think we're herding cats. There's so many people that are interested in digital public infrastructure right now, and there's a lot of really great work being done. And one of the things we're really trying to pivot to is understanding customer success stories, country success stories, and getting them in a position where they can talk about their success more openly. So taking kind of a page from the open source development model is having the countries be more open about their successes and frankly some of their failures. So not everyone is successful the first time around. So what we try to do is provide openings for those countries to share their journey and their progress, because that really helps with other countries that are in that the evaluation phase of how am I going to adopt new technologies for financial inclusion. So nothing's more compelling than hearing a sibling country, if you will, talk about their journey, their successes, and then we become the underlying, supporting infrastructure there. And really, then we can, talk more about how we can help other countries. But I think holding up as, countries that have been successful is really going to help everyone understand things more in near terms rather than in the terms of entity that's trying to promote, their offering.
Yeah, I'm the last one to jump in on this, but this is a question that we grapple with day in and day out, and I completely agree with Ed and Paula, which is I think there is great merit in developing global standards and making sure that people speak the same language, and that's definitely one of our efforts. And then in sharing, I think the importance of sharing failures is not spoken of enough. So the whole purpose of inclusive finance is to make sure that we have a positive impact on consumers. And we often find that consumer voices are missing in these conversations. And so that's been a big part of our effort to make sure that we can elevate some of the consumer voices and bring them into the room, even if not directly through organizations that work on behalf of consumers, like consumer advocacy groups and Consumers International and their affiliates. We also find that, when people talk about infrastructure and talk about policies at a country level, they forget that, there is a cascading impact on the lives of people. And so one of our efforts through both our convening platforms, which is Financial Inclusion Week and Responsible Finance Forum, is to break these silos and make sure that tech and financial service providers can talk to each other, or policymakers and regulators and practitioners can talk to each other, or even creative design thinkers and product designers can talk to regulators and consumer advocacy groups. So how do we really make sure that, because I think where we are and I'm just going to speak for 30 seconds, but I think where we are as a community or as the financial inclusion system right now is at the cusp of a change where you see lots of different actors, often, with different understanding of how to solve this problem. So, my mental image is often of people, of the elephant and the visually impaired people trying to find their way and trying to describe the elephant, but that is our problem. And I think the more we talk, the more we discuss and deliberate and collectively solve those problems, the closer we get to where we want to go.
So I'm sort of listening across all three of you answer, and I'm hearing some, silo busting, common language, and then also this idea of case studies, but also that, practical examples, but also practical examples that show the warts and all approach. Right. Because nobody wants just, it's intimidating to see just wild success stories, right? Those cause more angst and grief amongst the community than they do inspire action. Be curious, if you think about the work that all of you have done, have there been some examples of the kind of fail first projects, or the ones that stumbled out of the gate, but were willing to learn and kind of push forward, that kind of, to me, kind of become the more robust case studies over time? So where have you seen some projects that, did, kind of live with their struggles enough where it did, I love the concept of sort of sibling project or sibling country, where it actually helped those that came behind them?
Well, I'm not going to be the one to give a shout out to a country's failures, but I do know there are some, and I know that they're generally willing to talk about them in public settings. They're not necessarily willing to put it in a case study that gets circulated around the world. But what I have found is when you're at these events and conferences where we're talking about the challenges for deployment, that's when those anecdotes and stories come out. I think most people are happy to see their successes publicized, less so on their failures. But certainly, I found that in our convenings, at least, that the folks are pretty willing to share the challenges or stumbles that they've had along the way, just not as willing to let us harvest those for publication.
I mean, I think like our open source communities are good sort of internal means to share some of these lessons learned and identify the best practices and approaches to, overcome these pain points and overcome the rough patches that we've all gone through. And what I'd also add is that within Mifos, since we've been going at this for so long, we ourselves have pivoted and evolved both at a technology and organization level to sort of respond to the needs of the market. So we started out, as a project within the Green Foundation, just purely focused on microfinance. And our original and ultimate goal was to build the community and ecosystem we have now. But that first generation of our software wasn't doing that. So we had to rewrite from scratch, like separate out as our own nonprofit, and really there focus on building the community from the ground up. And we've been able to achieve that. But I think over time, we've seen that sometimes you have to pivot in your approach, and you have to recognize that you have to adapt to the current situation and evolve the technology, and then evolve your processes to help the technology move and help the players who are building solutions move along that as well.
Yeah. I'm actually wondering if we can reframe your question to say successes and learning moments rather than absolute failures. Because unlike in the investment world where firms potentially have to shut shop, and I think as a sector we've evolved, and I think a lot of those have come from speed bumps, which could be labeled failures, but they could also be labeled as learning moments. And I think so. If I look back, from where we are today to where we were, 10 years ago, I think microfinance and all the accompanying issues that we saw there, or limitations that we saw there, are what have led to, our current evolution in the inclusive finance space with technology. So, I'd say that's, like the access problem, and how do you deliver to the last mile? How do you make sure that affordable, that agent models are affordable, and that, it's viable in the long run? Or even with the DPI conversation where we are, so we started off with what we'd seen in India, and, before that with Estonia potentially, but now we're talking about open finance in Brazil, and we're talking about, which aspects of those can work in countries, and what's the local context, and what else needs to be done. So I think we're evolving. So these are learning moments, but I think what you've given me is an idea for systematically documenting these learning moments so that, we can reflect on it as a sector.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we do Fail Fest, 2024, but that there is a certain honesty. We reframe them as learning moments. I love, but where that does, that can often be as much of a help as the shiny case studies, too. So it's so interesting because so often, especially those of us that kind of come from technical backgrounds or technical projects, have this kind of tech will save us mentality. I'm not saying any of us here suggest that we have that, but that can be out there kind of sometimes in the ethos. And so if we assume that, the technical tools are not enough, and often sometimes the easiest part to solve, I think, as we sort of realize, what is going to be those other areas that we need to invest in to advance these ideas, to create the runway for the technology to take hold or gain interest or get users? So that just opening up that financial access through digital tools, in a vacuum or by itself is just devastatingly insufficient. So what else do we need to be working on as an ecosystem? What are the sort of spheres of influence we should be identifying?
I'm going to jump in here because this is, we've been grappling. So this week in our world has been DPI week, because we've been talking about DPI at different fora, including this one. And one of the frameworks that came up, which we've been thinking about a lot this week, is one that David Porteous brought up, which is, he talks about the opposing forces, which seem to drive DPI, but I really think they drive all of digital financial services. So they're equity and efficiency. So we seek equity for our consumers. We or, at some level also want to deliver value to the firm. So there's the efficiency angle. And then there is risks and rights of consumers. I think if we think about what we want to achieve along these four axes and really, the push and pull of these opposing forces, we can think about where there are stresses, and that's where the conversations need to happen. And that's where the measurement needs to happen to point us towards, are we really achieving what we want to achieve? Or is this getting skewed in one direction versus the other? And perhaps the answer lies there. Sorry for giving such a philosophical answer.
Yeah, well, I think digging into a little bit more around the equity and efficiency, and this goes back to some of what Paul and I have both mentioned, like right now with digital public infrastructure, a lot of focus is on getting those core, underlying true infrastructural foundational elements in place at the government level. The one piece, that we think is highly critical and often missing is thinking about those institutions that are, most efficient in going the last mile in reaching those in most of need of financial inclusion. And so that's where we try to fit in by providing that infrastructure, which, although not deployed at the government level, it does need to be deployed to allow an MFI to have a real-time account that could accept a Moja Loop payment, or it could have a digital account that could connect to a MOSIP ID. So I think a key part for us is helping ensure that those institutions that are on the fringe have the access to infrastructure like ours to provide these modern accounts, which are necessary for digital transacting. But we also believe that, like Paula said earlier, those entities who might not be responsibly serving these segments of the market, they can do so as well by adopting more of these standards, by adopting more of these equitable approaches, and by operating more efficiently using these open source digital public tools that we're developing.
And just to pivot on that, I think there's two foundational principles we really kind of focus on. One is around the word inclusive. So it's not about delivering the slickest software to a smartphone user. It's really about making sure that we don't put in barriers in our software design that eliminates anyone because they don't have the fastest or newest phone or the best internet connection. So those, your design principles really need to be focused on reaching the broadest possible community rather than chasing technology and the bright, shiny smartphones and new technologies out there, and even like 3G, 5G, 6G, all the Gs. We have to assume a low level of connectivity. We have to make sure the transactions execute very quickly and with the least sophisticated smartphone. So design principles for inclusivity are critical. But then the other thing that's critical that my team tries to focus on is really looking at the full set of stakeholders that are involved in the deployment of a national payment scheme, for example. It's not just a central bank. It's not just the hub operator. There's many other players in the mix that may want to connect and advance the solution. So earlier you engage them in the design of a new system or a supplemental system in some cases, the better. You can't just operate in a vacuum. All the different stakeholders have to be engaged early. Some of them will have barriers. Some of them will have, some reluctance in adopting a new system or concerns that maybe the central bank is overreaching. Getting those issues identified early in the evolution of a project, I think, is critically important.
Yeah, and just to expand a little bit on the expansive nature of the stakeholder ecosystem, I think what Paula brings up there is incredibly important, especially around thinking of all those digital financial service providers that are reaching the end customers and making sure, as she noted, the technology can be designed to be inclusive to meet their customers. But then another key audience, which is critical when actually coming down to adopting or deploying our tools, is that local ecosystem of support providers and system integrators. I think with the open source approaches that we have, it's a very conducive approach to enabling them to participate, enabling them to build sustainable local businesses where they can take the open source digital public good, they can localize it to their unique market. And these local support providers are key and critical because they understand, the actual needs of their customers. They're there on the ground. And while, we at the core entity guiding the digital public good can help to maintain that key underlying technology foundation, those local entities really represent the voice of the customer. They feed back enhancements to the technology, but they provide that last mile support to ensure that those institutions that have the furthest reach can be reached and they can be successfully deployed and supported on an ongoing basis. So those local integrators are a key part of that ecosystem too.
Can I jump in with a question to both Paula and Ed?
Please, Jayshree, go ahead.
Taking over your role here. Just
I love a co-host.
Which is, I'm not saying that I'm a Luddite. I believe in technology, but there are several parts of the world where, and this particularly goes back to the design question, right? You can design the best system that focuses on inclusion, but there are normative factors that can prevent, just access to a basic feature phone, particularly for, I think women and other vulnerable groups. How do we make sure that we deliver technology? And this is, again, at a philosophical level, because it's a question that we grapple with, which is, how do we make sure that we continue to provide choice, that there is both the analog and the digital system in a way where people that do not have access, and it's very difficult to change norms, so people that do not have access to digital services continue to have access at least to the analog services, so they're not completely excluded. Because you both work in fairly difficult geographies and with,
Yeah, what I've been surprised at, usually when we, I go to Africa, for example, 3 or 4 times a year, and at least, and every time we go, we usually ask someone local to take us to the markets to see where transactions are being conducted and how they're being conducted. And while cash is still king, let's face it, is still the predominant currency exchange, from a transaction standpoint. I'm amazed at how many people do have phones. I'm amazed at how many devices the merchants are encumbered with to conduct business, because if they want to serve the broadest group, they might have multiple relationships with service providers. So you'll see 2 or 3 or 5 card readers in their shop. You do see a lot of interchange between digital and analog. And that's where we're trying to address the costs, is because that transition from hard cash to a digital payment, think about a merchant or someone that has a small business that literally has to walk 2 miles to cash in and pay their utility or make a payment on their microfinance loan. They can continue to do that, but it's a cost to them to do that. And so if they can use a phone, which they have, to make a transaction and not incur those costs, that helps elevate them as far as their financial well-being. So it's not that we're even suggesting that they eliminate cash altogether, but in those areas where they can reduce the transaction costs and the encumbrances of cash, walking 2 miles to cash in. It's not only a physical challenge. It's there's a cost associated with it, and there's a safety issue associated with it.
Yeah.
And we found that even during COVID, more and more entities shifted their interest in getting rid of cash for just the fact that cash is not clean, right? So during pandemic times, the more one can do digitally, the better. So I don't see us replacing cash, but what we want to do is reduce the pain points associated with using cash, transaction costs, physical safety, and the practicality of having to make those treks to deal with your transactions.
The point of cost is really interesting because I was chatting with colleagues at the Better Than Cash Alliance, and I think they have a report coming out because they spoke to micro and small enterprise owners that have been adopting digital financial services and as a result of the pandemic. And they found that a lot of them have joined these informal groups like WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups just to get information on emerging scams. And one of the points they've provided as feedback is they like digital, and it's consumer demand led, but the cost, which is something we haven't factored in, which is the cost of navigating these additional social groups just to get a sense of emerging scams is now, like an additional burden that they need to navigate. So yeah.
Small point just to go to that cost aspect too, because what Paula raises is a very key and important point. But I think the peeling back the onion, one other layer, like those institutions that are then helping to digitize and help to replace that cash, they themselves struggle as well from the cost and technology perspective, where they often are working on a paper-based system right now, so it would be challenging for them to then digitize their transactions. And so that's where we try to jump in by doing that. And then this still alone doesn't address Dicey's problem, though, where still, let's say they don't have internet connectivity, it's going to be difficult for them to have a real-time system in which to conduct that transaction digitally, or maybe the consumer doesn't have a phone. We try to be open in our approaches where we can support other means like vouchers instead of a real-time payment to help get that transaction to go through. And then also trying to make sure that our software, even if it does need to run in the cloud, there are offline manners or ways to send and sync that data, such that we can offer most of the benefits of these modern systems, but still adapt to the local on the ground constraints that are still present, even as infrastructure continues to expand and grow and permeate the wider segments of the market.
If you kind of put on your kind of what I like to call near future casting hat, right? So not flying cars and teleportation systems, but what might happen? What are you excited about in digital financial inclusion that might start to materialize over the next couple of years? And sort of how what's that vision for the future that we're working towards that kind of gets you kind of out of bed every day and working on these issues?
Yeah, I say one thing that I'm keenly interested in is the integration points between different digital public goods. So for Ed mentioned MOSIP, which is a digital ID platform, and we've been doing some work with them. Sometimes integrating with other technologies is esoteric until you have a customer. And one example that we've been working on is government to person payments, G2P. And that involves having an identity solution as well as payments and factoring all different types of payment distributions, not just to a phone, because in some cases, like for example, refugee situations, they may not have a phone. So looking at that challenge, which is pretty complex, it deals with government payments to citizens, refugees, immigrants, people that have technology, don't have technology, have bank accounts, don't have bank accounts, may have, paper ID, don't have digital ID. So it's a huge undertaking, and a lot of different factors to consider and a lot of different technologies at play. Tackling that is, I think, really exciting. It's complex, but there's the will there. Ed's involved in that initiative as well with MIFOS. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the success of some of these G2P pilots in the next year or two.
Yeah, I can go next. And so I think sort of our blue sky vision, or what we are aiming to see, it's been in our mindset for quite some time now, but I think the pieces are starting to come together where that can be a reality. So we, believe, as others do, that financial services are an essential human right, but not just access to these services, but actual usage of them. And why I think we're starting to get there now is that with this movement around digital public infrastructure, we're getting to a place where everyone can be included, where they have a digital identity. They can, get access to a payment through Mojaloop. And then through the infrastructure we provide, they can have a connected account. And our means of helping to get to this blue sky moment where everybody's included with a functional account, that they can get access to a loan, that they can save effectively to, that they can, prevent getting bitten by fraud, is our vision of shared infrastructure. So where we see this is having a common digital financial services platform that's delivered in the cloud, where it can provide that underlying infrastructure to identify, or SOCO to manage an account. It can provide that connection to allow them to seamlessly participate in a payment system like Mojaloop. It can enable them to harness the benefits of AI to prevent fraud. it can enable them to have access to modern credit scoring. But we believe by having that common platform that's available and accessible in the cloud, there's a level playing field, a common language at a technology level for others to adopt the ecosystem to build solutions around and to really enable that vision where everybody's not just connected, but they actually have financial services that they can use.
And I mean, I think of a lot of things and we do a lot of cool experiments, but I think what I'd like to see and what we've seen so far, I think in the digital world or in the innovation enabled by digital world is a lot of innovation on the design and design of interesting products and services. What I'd like to see is innovation on the other side, which is post sales, with redress, with consumer complaints. Is there a way to make sure that that process is streamlined as well?
Had a question that built on your blue sky answers there. Here's the shoe drop, right? It's always easier to look at the challenge from these greenfield perspectives of introducing solutions for the digital financial inclusion. But the many countries, legacy, partial implementations, et cetera, what challenges does that give that drive to adoption and inclusion? So, and maybe answering that kind of gives us a little bit of some action items as we leave this salon and what we could be working on.
Yeah, in fact, probably half of the countries that we talk to have pre-existing systems. And in many cases, they're talking to us because they have unmet needs, unmet features that they can't deliver out into the marketplace. So for us, we need to make sure that our design, which is an open platform, is set up so it has the sufficient APIs that we can knit into an existing infrastructure rather than replace. Because in a lot of cases, they've invested a tremendous amount of money, and not only in technical infrastructure, but in their staffing and training and use of these systems. So what we want to be able to do is plug into those systems and extend and enhance what they offer to their citizens rather than necessarily replace it. Over time, they may feel that their older systems are clunky or costly and might want to migrate over to a newer system, but that's not a requirement. What we want to be able to do is extend and enhance their infrastructure to reach more people, to provide more cost-effective services, not throw away the baby with the bathwater, if you will. We really want to be integrating into existing systems rather than necessarily replacing them.
Yeah, adding to what Paula said, I think we like to think of our approach as having building blocks, that are accessible via APIs that others can take, and they can, pick and choose which building blocks they utilize, but they can integrate them with their other existing systems, and we can try to, provide as many reference applications or demonstration use cases for how to best adopt these. But we want to provide those tools and then provide the integration endpoints to connect in a supportive community to help with that adoption. But that's what I'd add to that challenge that David raised.
And we work on this at the level of regulatory capacity. So making sure that regulators understand what is the kind of innovation that's going on, but also what is the kind of regulation that needs to be framed in order to prevent consumer harm, so that the whole effort is not abandoned halfway through. But I think what you're also raising is an important point that we don't work on, but is something that we need to all address, which is funding and the fiscal base for revenues. And that in many countries has led to partial implementation or abandoned projects. But it's an important question.
Well, we only have a few more minutes here, and always good when you give us our time to give you some time back to sort of give you a little bit of a preview about what's going on in each of your homes and your organizations, and some towards this end of pushing this field forward. What are some things that we should be watching for, looking for, and most importantly, probably participating in that's coming from your respective organizations? Jayshree, I'll kick it off to you, and then maybe we'll do Ed, and then finish with Paula to give everyone a little bit of a running order. So Jayshree, give us the trailer. What's the coming attractions of what's coming up at CFI?
Well, lots of things coming up at CFI, but just in terms of broader participation, I think are two important convening platforms. So we have the Responsible Finance Forum, which brings together all the stakeholder groups that we just spoke about in person. So that's happening between the 3rd and 5th of July in Fortaleza in Brazil. And then Financial Inclusion Week, which is the biggest event that in the financial inclusion sector that really is a grassroots driven movement because people submit ideas on what they're working on. That's happening in October. So both of those are important to keep in mind. And then we have a number of research studies coming out, including one on Gen AI. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Ed, what's the trailer?
For us, it goes back to the shared infrastructure, the interoperability amongst digital public goods. So right now, there's a concept, DPI as a service, that is emerging to help countries, seamlessly adopt multiple digital public goods at once. We have a project, that we're working on called Mojafos that is helping to bring together Mifos, Mojaloop, all in one deployable package to help reduce that barrier to adoption. And so that's one of the key focuses, is just helping the deployability, helping the adoption. And then, that's one of our things in our lens right now.
All right, Paula, what's coming up at Mojaloop? You're busy in these couple weeks.
Yeah, well, 3 times a year we convene our community, 2 times a year in Africa and 1 time virtually. And so in 2 weeks, we'll be in Kenya, March 25th through 28th. These are sessions that are hosted both virtually and live, face-to-face. And there's sessions in the first 2 days. The agenda is already up for the March meeting. The first 2 days are much more business focused, talking about proof of concepts, implementation challenges, et cetera, some of those things that we've touched on earlier. And then as we progress through the week, it gets more deep technically with regard to the actual platform. We do it 3 times a year. We'll do it again in July, and we'll do it in late October, early November. But if folks just want to pop in, you can register virtually. It's free. You can look at the agenda and just pop into sessions that you if you want to whet your appetite with regards to Mojaloop, there's hopefully a session or 2 that would be impactful for you.
Awesome. Amazing. ILF, we'll have some new grant opportunities that'll be rolling out in the next couple weeks and months as we reboot our grant making programs for the year. I think we have some information on our annual summit that should be being announced here soon as well. Think about it in the late October time span. And continuing to do our work with the protocol. So we will collect all the relevant links, and when we share this out via video and audio, it will carry with it all of the various digital breadcrumbs to get to the ideas, topics, and activities that we have discussed with today. So thank you so much. The inaugural mission of the Interledger Salon, and we could not have had a better group of guests. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
all
Chris.
Right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.